everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. I see some awesome familiar faces there. It's good to see you. Hey, Caleb. Thank you guys so much for joining us with this discussion with Andre Henry. We're super excited to be bringing you his voice, both singing and speaking. So I thought I'm going to start off just by giving a little bit of a bio and intro on Andre, and then we have a special treat because he's going to sing his latest single for us, and then we're going to get started. So just for your background, Andre is he's a man of many things, but he is a student of nonviolent struggle and social change. He's including studying leadership and nonviolent movements for social change through the Harvard Kennedy School. He specializes in using digital media to educate and mobilize audiences for racial justice and social progress. And he has served as managing editor at Relevant Media Group, and he is currently a contributing editor for the Sider Center for Peace and Justice in Philadelphia. He's a content expert for the Fuller Leadership Platform and research assistant for the Innovation for Vocation Project. He has earned theology degrees from both Southeastern University and Fuller Seminary. And we're so excited to kick things off with his latest single called People of the World. So I will let you share that, Andre.
All right. Social progress has always been won by a few outraged, organized, ordinary people. They weren't born on Mount Olympus. They weren't deputized through some angelic visitation. They were just ordinary, outraged people who decided they had enough of oppression. We don't need any messiahs. We need ordinary, organized, outraged people. We do. You have the power to bring this society to Nazis took her husband. She was shocked and terrified. My God, can you even imagine? But she chased the paddy wagon with tears from her eyes, down to Rose Street, where the soldiers kept them captive. A sea of angry women gathered in the snow, shouting at the soldiers, saying, let our husbands go. The soldiers drew their weapons, but the crowd refused to move. That's how those women overthrew Hitler's evil. If the people are before, then we can win again. People of the world, let's get it started. Everyone got a role to play. Don't have to feel helpless or discarded. Where there is a will, we can make a way. Oh, yeah. Oh. The police came to arrest the lady when she refused to give her seat up for a white man. When people heard about her case, whoa, it set off a chain reaction. Here they kept the struggle, braving heat and snow and rain, saying till you treat us fairly, we will rise of us again. When the merchants saw the business start to crumble in that town, they had to reconsider trying to keep our people down. So if the people won before, then we can win again. People of the world, let's get it started. Everyone has got a role to play. We don't have to feel helpless or discarded. Where there is a will, we can make a way. People of the world, we have the power to bring about the world that ought to be. We really are the heroes that we long for. We only need to fight and we'll be free. Maybe, oh, somebody say, oh, say I'm a hero, we're the heroes. Say, oh, oh, say I'm a hero. We're the heroes. Say, I'm a hero. We're the heroes. I'm a hero. We're the heroes. Say,
People of the world, let's get it. People of the world, let's get it.
Thank you.
That was awesome. I love that song. I've heard it a few times, but I haven't gotten to see you sing it live. So what a special treat that was. And I'll brag for a second because my daughter and I are sending a little recording for that song. So, so we are one of the many voices on there singing very often. So I know Andre is going to switch microphones here for a second. So we're going to give him a chance to do that. And then I'm going to let him share a little bit of his story and how he really got involved with all the work in social justice that you've been doing for a while. So tell us a little bit about what got you started in all of this.
Yeah, of course. Well, first, I'm really excited to talk with you and Michael today, and thanks everybody for coming to chat with us. You know, this is awesome. I really started speaking up more consistently about racial injustice in the summer of 2016 after I watched Philando Castile bleed to death on Facebook Live after being, shot by a local police officer in Minneapolis. And this was the second viral police-involved murder that week. It was the day after Alton Sterling was killed by police in New Orleans. Growing up black in America, I happened to notice racism was a problem, but I don't think that, I know I didn't understand in depth what it meant when people talked about systemic racism. I knew that, growing up in school, like sometimes that, the black kids would get in trouble more often than the white kids. And when they did, they were often punished more harshly. I noticed, walking into stores and being followed by either the cashier or the clerk or, or being profiled in New York City when I lived there, for 7 years. And, cab drivers who assume that you're going to Brooklyn and so they don't want to pick you up because that's a historically black neighborhood, or, being profiled by the police. I was nearly arrested 3 times for just kind of going about my business in New York because of stop and frisk policies there and stuff. So I knew that stuff, but it was more intuitive, right, from my personal experience. But when I watched Alton Sterling and Philando Castile die that week, I made a decision after spending about a year of just kind of posting here and there that I was no longer going to let the news cycle determine when I talked about racism, because what it seemed like was happening was that people just assume that if they don't know what's going on, like if there's not a viral news story, then, there's nothing to report, right? And so I was like, okay, well, the thing that I can do is I can share from my own experiences as a black person in America, and I can do that as often as I remember. And I decided that day, that was the first thing, no longer let the news cycle determine when I talk about racism. Second thing was I was going to really invest time into understanding the history and the systems of racial injustice in America. And so I started just reading voraciously. I started a reading group on Facebook, and we read The New Jim Crow. We read Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. We were just devouring books to try to understand how did things come to be this way. And the third commitment that I made that day was that I would invest my body in the struggle for racial justice in some way. And I didn't really know what I was getting into when I made that commitment, because about 3 weeks later, I was sitting on my couch in Pasadena, California, and I had, I guess you could say it was a vision, right? Where I saw myself in this park in old Pasadena preaching like a street preacher. And I was standing next to this really large boulder that had been painted white, and on that boulder was written like all of these different racial injustices that weigh heavily on the Black psyche. And when I came back to myself, my conscious self, I'm trying to make this story really short, so there are things that I want to be like, jump into. And the thing is that I was conscious in the vision. I was as conscious as I am right now. So when I came back to myself in my living room in Pasadena, and I felt like I was really supposed to do this thing, like I was supposed to get a boulder, I was supposed to paint it white, I was supposed to write all of these names and injustices on it. And I really didn't want to, because it sounded like something, it just sounds crazy to me. It sounded crazy to me, but I felt compelled to do it. And so I did. By that night, I had procured a 100-pound boulder, granite boulder. I painted it white that night. Some friends gave me, they gave me the money to buy a wagon from Home Depot so I could cart it around because it was too heavy for me to carry. And the next day, I lugged that boulder to Fuller Seminary, where I was still in school, and I sat in the middle of the campus and I started writing all the things that I could remember from that vision on that boulder. And I started, I took that boulder with me everywhere I went for about 4 months. And then for the last 2 months, I took it only to church, because a mentor of mine challenged me and said, who needs to hear this message? And I really felt deeply that the churches that I was leading music at, on Sundays, that I needed to bring it there. And that is kind of, that season really changed my life. Like, as I was lugging that boulder around, I got the sense that you ever get on a roller coaster and like just as it's about to go up that first hill, you're like, no, wait, let me off. Somewhere along the way of dragging somewhere along the way of dragging that boulder, I was like, oh wait, this is a whole ride, right? And I've been doing art and music and writing and speaking about racial injustice and learning everything that I can about racial injustice, but also how do ordinary people work together to change the world. I thought about people like Dr. King and other civil rights activists who, obviously not enough has changed since the 50s and 60s, but a lot has changed, right? And it changed through nonviolent struggle. So that second commitment that I made to learn everything that I can about racial injustice took me on this journey, not of just art and speaking and all that kind of stuff, but also so many books and so many conversations with people who have, started international movements, people who have toppled dictators, people, I can't believe where the ride has taken me. And so here I am, still doing that and inviting others to come, because like I was just singing, like we need millions of ordinary, organized, outraged people to confront these injustices through nonviolent struggle.
Yes. Thank you, Andre. That's a powerful story and testimony, and how you wed your own passion with art. And you said invest your body in that, and that's a high calling, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's almost biblical, right?
Yes.
That's almost difficult. Deny thyself, pick up your cross and follow me. Who's following, the Christ, the Messiah, into a new way of living and engaging the world. That's powerful. And you're blessed to be able to have that creativity that you can share with other people. Yeah. But you really focused on right now this aspect that is so critical in our nation now. Yes. Things are changing in that regard. And in some ways, things have not changed because people forget that we're really a relatively new nation in terms of civil rights. Yeah. That began in the 60s, right? That's when Black people became fully citizens in that they were able to vote, right? Civil Rights Act. And then, of course, the Immigrant Naturalization Act came into existence. So when we talk about change, it's taken a long time. It wasn't just 400 years. It's even a blink of an eye, if you will, in history to make this happen. But people have done that. People have done that in South Africa, right? In India, in some way, in other. So when you talk about civil resistance, now that right now in the media, and a lot of people kind of like, whoa, I don't know what about that. I know they come on out in force, right? They have all the people, Black Lives Matter, everything like that. But then where does it go, right? Right. So what is civil resistance for you, right? That's a provocative phrase. I'll come back to you in terms of people of faith, but let's just parse that out, how you think about that, right?
For sure. So I'm very particular about using the phrase civil resistance because it implies nonviolent struggle. But what has happened with the term nonviolence is that there have been so many ideas that have been attached to the word nonviolence that it has come to mean for many people a form of inaction, right? So a lot of folks they think of nonviolence as a position that you hold in your heart and that you express with your mouth, right? Now, I love that you mentioned following Christ in this. And I always get nervous about talking about, my faith involved with it because I don't feel like I'm a very good Christian, but I do try, I do try to follow Jesus. And so one thing that occurs to me as we talk about that is the passage in James where he says that faith without works is dead, right? It's not enough to just say that we're against violence, but you have to do something. So anyway, you asked me what do I mean by civil resistance. The way that I would summarize this is that civil resistance is a way to confront oppression without harming anyone or using weapons or bloodshed. It's a direct way of acting. It is strategic. It is, I just said active, I'm going to keep saying active. It's strategic. It's active. And it's actually confrontational. The other thing that it's divisive. It's divisive. It polarizes because what civil resistance does is it tries to identify the power sources of an oppressive system and tries to figure out which of those power sources are actually dependent on the participation of ordinary people. And then once we figure that out, we say, all right, let's withdraw our participation in that way, or let's actually put our bodies in the way or put ourselves in, let's impede the path of that oppressive system, that oppressive monster. Michael, you just opened it up for me to do to connect theology to this, so I'm just going to do it. Revelation talks about the beast, right? In Revelation 13, and the original audience for that book of Revelation understood that the beast was the Roman Empire. It was Caesar. So when we're doing civil resistance, we're actually planning an intervention against the beast.
Yeah.
Without becoming like the beast, without using the tools of the beast. That's all I had.
Right. Well, you quote that book, and in some ways, and in many ways, we are living in apocalyptic times, aren't we?
Yes.
Revealing. That's what the term means, right?
Yes,
about
absolutely.
What really has transpired in
Absolutely.
our country and of course the world, right?
Mhm.
And you share that through your own experience of how you've engaged this systemic evil, right? This malignancy that seems to be there forever, right? And mutating and taking on and consuming and killing people, right? We've seen it.
Yeah.
And you just called it out.
Yes.
So this active civil resistance, right? It's not just a concept. It's not me just signing a little petition, sending an email blast, sending my dollars. Those are all important actions, right?
Yeah.
But I think you're calling us to a higher engagement that is sometimes, as you said, divisive.
Yeah.
Christ kind of like, hey, some of us, you might have a problem with your family when you follow me, right? That's true, right?
Yes.
It wasn't like, oh, we're going to love each other, hold hands, and, sing Here We Are the World. Beautiful. But I think, this aspect of faith of Christ, this very embodiment of, and this is where I come from, because I grew up in a Spanish-speaking environment. It's a seek ye first the kingdom of God and the divine righteousness. Well, in my language, it was called en la justicia de Dios, the justice of God, right? That's not a passive kind of thinking and let's just sing and praise God. Beautiful. But I think you're calling us to something more powerful, because you said invest the body. That's embodiment, incarnation. Brother, you got me too. So you're living it. You're telling us, you're being prophetic in that regard. But how do you talk to people? You're talking to everybody, people who are of faith and non-faith, right?
Yes.
So the language really resonates with the non-faith people, because they understand we got to do something. We get up in somebody's face, and we can't step back from when we see something wrong.
Yes.
You're asking something else. Go ahead.
The point that you're making. Okay, so when we talk about how we talk to people of faith about this and how we talk to people who are not of faith or who don't subscribe to, the Christian, or don't subscribe to a faith in that way. I find that, I grew up in the evangelical church. And I have found that when talking to people of Christian faith, especially from the evangelical world, that the barriers to participation in civil resistance are much higher for folks who claim to, or for many folks who claim to follow Jesus, in that kind of world. I'm trying not to make too broad of a statement, because there are so many. When you study the history of nonviolent struggle of civil resistance, there are so many times you find religious people of faith, spiritual people, all this. So it's huge. But in my experience, oftentimes we have to confront these theological barriers to get people, many people who follow, who identify as Christian, to get them involved in this direct confrontation with oppression. Yes.
And can I just be a little bit provocative there? Is it really a theology or ideology?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And that's a political power that a lot of people don't understand. So like the ideologies that we have as Americans are the things that the powers that be, to borrow from theologian Walter Wink, the powers that be, ideology is what the powers that be usually depend on to keep people from rebellion, right?
Yeah, right.
Them in place. So we want everyone to keep on, talking about what the Kardashians are doing. We want everyone to keep focusing on buying consumer goods. We want everyone to keep on just believing that America is the greatest country in the world, that it's immune to systemic oppression, that it is the paragon of democracy and freedom, that it can do no wrong, and all of these ideas, those narratives, those are the things that the powers that be depend on to keep us in place. And so this is a good time, I think, to talk about the pillars of power in society. As civil resistance, when we think about confronting a system of oppression, we imagine something like a temple, and the roof of that temple is the issue. So right now we're going to say it's racism. It's system of racism. And the columns that hold that roof up are the different institutions in society that support that social problem. One of those pillars is exactly what you one of those pillars, those institutions, is organized religion. And sometimes that institution can use the political power of ideology, which we're calling theology, right? It can use that political power to tell people that it's actually sinful for you. Like, if you're against America, you're against God, right?
Yes, right.
That to be a good Christian means that you have to be a patriot, right? Now, I want to be clear and say, like, to be a good activist doesn't mean that you have to be an expatriate, right?
Right.
But we can't conflate the two things automatically. Otherwise, we also can't be loyal to God, right? Like, if our allegiance is automatically given to the nation in a naive way, in an uncritical way.
Yeah, that's right. And you're saying something that people forget, or maybe aren't necessarily cognizant of. They say, "Oh, the system's broken," but you're telling the system isn't broken. It was set up that way, right? Yes. Someone had advantage over another person or a group of people, and some of that is based on the color of a person's skin. Right? That is set up a certain way, right? This exceptionalism about our country, and maybe, to be a good patriot even means we test out those ideals that you're talking about,
right?
And then, do they align with those people who subscribed or have the banner of, yes, I'm a Christian? So that's a big issue there, right? Does this ideology align with some of the values and the tensions we find in the gospel, if you will, in the Christian Bible or in the Hebrew Bible as well? And not to become too preachy here, but I'm trying to really get at, and you already kind of capitalized it, but let's tease it out more. If I'm a good Christian or a good patriot, is civil resistance really a marker of that, or is it extraneous to that?
Right. Well, that's a really good question, and it makes me think of a couple of things, right? And this is where we get to the examples of civil resistance that we've seen in history that have been successful, because civil resistance is the engine of history, right? That America has evolved in the way that it has, even though it has a long way to go. But the human rights evolution that has happened in America has happened because oppressed and marginalized people organize themselves to push against oppression, while deciding that they will not do it in a way that just creates more of the same, right? They're going to do it through a different weapons system that doesn't involve bloodshed, right? And what they were doing, how they understood themselves to be actually doing something patriotic by saying, this country claims to be a land for all people, a land of the free, a home of the brave. Well, right now, it is not the land of freedom for Mexican immigrants. It's not the land of freedom for African American people. It's not the land of freedom for immigrants of Asian descent. And so they organized and pushed until they could win some more of those democratic gains. And to them, they were saying, this is the most American thing that we can do, right?
Yes.
Didn't America begin with a revolution, right?
Yes,
and
right.
So they are carrying that revolutionary spirit. And they also understood themselves, many of them understood themselves to be moving with the Spirit of God, right? When I started carrying that boulder around, I didn't know if I believed in God anymore, you know? When I had that vision, I didn't know if I did. And then I had to go through this whole spiritual journey through that process of where I recovered faith in God, but I came to understand God in a very different way. And one of the ways that I understand God right now is to be the spirit, the force that pushes us toward revolution. And I think that the book of Exodus captures that, right? Because the Hebrews in this story, understanding that at the time, the word Hebrew comes from this ancient Near Eastern word Habiru, and it wasn't really an ethnic marker at the time. It was more of a social distinction that vagrants and vagabonds and shepherds and outcasts and crooks and criminals, those were Hebrews. And God taps Moses on the shoulder and basically says, "Hey, I'm about to start a revolution. Would you like to come and be a part of it?" You know,
Right.
And that's why, you know, to see these Hebrew midwives who get the command from Pharaoh to kill these Hebrew babies, they participate in civil disobedience when they decide that they're not going to, right?
Right.
And they lie to Pharaoh's henchmen, the security forces, so that they can continue to do what they believe is right. So that is the spirit of civil resistance. That's the spirit of nonviolent struggle.
It's powerful. And I'm glad you brought us to that the Exodus experience, right? That's just powerful in that it shows once again that the God I believe in is very concerned about the well-being of those that are most marginalized.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And what does it mean to be human? How to lift up that sense of humanity?
Yes.
And this we have a tough gig here, brother. And I'm talking a person of color to another person of color, because we've been in many ways colonized by a theology, by institution that you just called out, organized religion. And so we have to really have struggled with our own liberation, right?
Yes.
And many people of color are in that point right now of saying, you know, what do I subscribe to? There are aspects of the gospel that resonates with us, but then the way we're supposed to live it, it seems like it's already predetermined how good of a Christian are you? And if you engage in these kinds of activities, then maybe you're suspect.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, absolutely. The first thing that I had to do in order to get on this roller coaster I talked about, like there was a whole process of first off, realizing that the white people in my life who I loved and cherished, that told me that I was a heretic, that told me that I was forsaking the greatest commandment to love my neighbor as myself and all this other kind of stuff. That what these people really wanted to do, they wanted to stop me from organizing for my own freedom. They wanted to stand in the way of my liberation. And so I had to break relationship with some people. I had to shake the dust off my feet and walk away. And I had to break free of the programming, the mental programming that said that justice was, somehow tangential or auxiliary to the Christian faith. And that really messed me up, because there was this one day where I was sitting on that same couch in that season, and I had to think about all these white pastors are telling me that racism is not a priority to God, which is a direct quote, and all this other stuff. And I zoomed through the history of how white supremacy has been Christianity has been weaponized by white supremacy to oppress, black and brown people throughout history. And I said, my God, what if they're right? Like, what if I should just listen to these men? Like, they're telling me that Christianity and civil resistance, organizing, uprisings are not compatible, right? Now, and I had to really wrestle with that, because when you do look at the history, you can see that. And then I had to think about, though, wait a minute, you have to think about the Nat Turners, the Harriet Tubmans, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s, the Cesar Chavez's, all of these people who their faith moved them to confront oppression. And that's a completely different type of Christianity, and those two are different. I think Walter Brueggemann talks about this in Prophetic Imagination.
You're right.
Where he talks about basically civil religion, right? The religion that holds the gods captive. And therefore, because the gods are completely loyal to Pharaoh, they are not free to make their own decisions about what happens to the oppressed. They have to agree that basically the gods are the government, right? And America has its own form of civil resistance, right? And we see this in the artwork where people paint Jesus, guiding Donald Trump's pen in the White House, or Jesus writing the Constitution or something like that.
Right.
That's a very different type of religion, right? Than the type of religion that led Nat Turner to actually, go to war against his masters,
Yes, right,
or the religion that led nonviolent civil resistors to tear down Jim Crow in the 50s.
Okay, all right. What I'm hearing is that even when we claim our own sense of identity, and I hear we're talking about people of color, Black lives in particular, when we claim that, I think that's almost an act of resistance, right? I'm resisting the white establishment as how they interpreted Christ to me, or impose certain kinds of perspectives of how I should be about, right?
Yes.
We don't do those things here. This is the way. So there's already even how we worship. Come on.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, absolutely.
It's already prescribed of how we should live, right? And what that means for us to do that. So it seems like civil resistance or resistance to the dominant culture is a spectrum, right?
Yes.
One from active engagement on the streets, to even with claiming our own sense of identity, of who we are, we created by, right?
Yes.
Because I'm fighting to say, hey, don't impose that Eurocentric theology on me.
Right. There are so many different ways for people to participate in civil resistance and in nonviolent struggle. And I think that's what you're getting at, is that there's internal work to do.
Mm-hmm.
There's the work of creating alternatives to the systems that exist.
Yes.
There's the work of actually going out in direct action and, blocking traffic and planning marches and boycotts and all that kind of stuff. There are just so many ways for us to do it. And that's why it takes, that's why I said earlier, it takes millions of people,
Yes.
There's a lot of work to be done.
Yes.
Right.
And that...
I would love to make a comment really quick, because, something that I'm learning as I'm listening to both of you talk right now, even is white people have never had to read the Bible in the ways that you are reading it. You know what I mean? Like because we have been in power, so we have not read the Bible, or we have not. I'll speak for myself. I haven't read the Bible, and I haven't viewed God in the ways that you are describing here, and what a huge miss,
Yes.
I just and how empty, and how empty it has felt, to not see God as or Jesus. I mean, we've always said Jesus was a revolutionary, but not in terms of the ways that you are describing.
Yeah, right.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. And just an aside there, maybe calling out a sister that Andre and I know, Lisa Sharon Harper. She has a number of podcasts on decolonizing the Bible, right?
Yeah.
And there's some books about how to read the Bible from the margins. And that has been my own path too, Andre. It isn't like I was popped out and I had an epiphany like you did. About what we do. It's taken it's a journey, because this aspect of this insidious malignancy called the supremacy of whiteness and all that props it up was indoctrinated, inculcated to me because I was educated, or quoting a former president, educated, thinking a certain way, believing a certain way, and I went through, like you did, Christian institutions, right?
Yes.
And I was told one time that the real theology comes from Europe, nothing south of the border.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly.
And so I start writing and thinking like a German theologian or other theologians. But I also, and you kind of hinted on that, Walter Wink's, I talked about the powers that be, and it really helped me about the demon, the evil that's there, that people say, well, we just got to vote in or elect or put people of faith into those in structures. No, the structure itself,
Right.
right? That pillar you talked about, right, brother?
And this is the tragedy of this that we're talking about now, is that the dirty truth about how society changes is that the oppressed have to organize ourselves, right? Doesn't mean that no one else can participate, but
Okay.
those who occupy the more privileged, levels of society, they don't wake up with the existential need to dismantle white supremacy.
There you
right?
go.
And
Yeah.
so they
Yeah.
lead it, right? So because it's something that they can opt in or opt out of, right? But people who are living in the margins, who understand that they are living in the margins, because it's like we said, you can be trained, whether it's through public school or through seminary or whatever, you can be trained to think like a white person if you're not,
Yes.
And so, but those who live in the margins and know it, we have to organize. We have to map out that temple. We have to identify those institutions. We have to identify what powers those institutions are using, and how those powers are given to those institutions by masses of ordinary people. Then we have to organize those masses of ordinary people to withdraw or withdraw that power, or to cause that power to backfire. And we've got to do it in a sustained way. We've got to do it for years, right? We've got to do that work. And the tragedy that's happening is that white people, whether they're religious or not, they want to impose a framework onto the way that we view and interpret the world that keeps us from doing that work.
Yes.
And the sad part about it is that sometimes it works. Oftentimes it works.
Right. It works.
Many of us, I remember, if you asked me 10 years ago, right? Would I be at at something like a Black Lives Matter protest? I might not have been, because I didn't realize that racism is not just, an individual, emotion, and an individual attitude, right? I thought that maybe they're just a few bad apples, in the police force, but it wasn't. I didn't know the links of the police force to the slave patrols. I didn't know that the Texas Rangers centuries ago could be hired by white people to go and abuse Mexican people. I didn't know these things, right?
Yes.
And the reason I didn't know these things is because we are not taught an accurate history in school.
All right.
We are given national myths as history, right?
Yes.
That cause us to be blind to the many ways that racism, that white supremacy informs almost the working of every institution in American society.
Yes.
That's the tragedy of this. And so I think that it's really important when we talk about, breaking the spell, breaking the spell of white supremacy. On white people and on people.
Absolutely.
Black people.
Exactly. And that's a pretty good comment.
How do you do that with white? Because and asking this as a white person who am learning this. My work really started learning this when I started working for prison fellowship and started going into the prisons, and that was my eye opener, to really begin to understand all of this. But there are so many white people, and I argue with them, I feel like daily in my family, good people, Christian people, all of these people we're talking about, and how do we get them? How do I get them to see? I can, and that is, or begin to have the scales come off their eyes. And I know for myself, I'm 40 this year, and it's taking me a long time for these scales to start to be removed myself. And I'm so thankful that it's happening. But there are people that continue to argue and argue and argue. And you're just like, how do I begin to move? How do we begin to move them?
There's a couple of thoughts that I have here. One is about the spectrum of allies. The other one is about spectacular interventions. So let's talk about the spectrum of allies first. When I started speaking up about racism, I thought, like a lot of people do, that there's this binary: people who are against racism, people who are for it. But the truth is that there's a spectrum when we're talking about any issue, right? So there are people who are the leading activists against white supremacy, against anti-Black violence, all that kind of stuff, systems of racial oppression. And then there's Richard Spencer at the other end of that spectrum, right? Or
wow.
You know, or something like that. The KKK, the alt-right, all that kind of stuff. But in between, there are people who they support the status quo, but they're not going to actively oppose you. Like they're not activists for the status quo. They believe in it and they hold to it, and they're not doing anything actively about it. There are people who are kind of in the middle, and they don't have really strong opinions about it either way, you know, and they're just not doing anything. There are people who are for anti-racism but aren't doing anything, right, and are not active, you know. And then you're back at the other side of the spectrum. And so many of us think that the real work to be done is to go to the furthest side of the spectrum and try to get Richard Spencer to become an anti-racist, right? That's a waste of time. You know, we should not be doing that kind of work, especially not Black people and people of color. Should not be begging racists to become anti-racist or trying to cajole them into doing so. Where the numbers are in civil resistance is in the middle. You want to find those people who are movable in the middle, the people who feel like they are neutrals, and you want to try to move them at least into the passive supporter space of anti-racism. And then where they're in the passive place, you want to move them into the active space, right? So that's where we really, first off, need to be moving. But that's more, and well, actually, let me say more about that. We need to think for changing society, for the culture shift that needs to happen, and for the institutional shift that needs to happen. We need to not just think, how can we get this individual person from here to there? We need to think about social blocks of people. Because one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is time, you know, and Dr. King talks about time a lot in his work, and that we need this concerted effort, you know, to happen at the same rate or faster than those who are organizing for white supremacy. We don't always, it's like sometimes we think about white supremacy as a static thing, right? But we don't realize, like, the reason why you get Jim Crow after slavery and mass incarceration after Jim Crow, and now we're dealing with a global upsurge of white nationalism, and the president is trying to become a dictator by using the technology of white supremacy and racism, is because white supremacy is adaptive. These people organize very well to preserve the white supremacist status quo, which means that we have to organize very well. So it's good to talk to your racist uncle and all that other kind of stuff. Like, yes, please confront them. However, the work to be done to build power, because this is what we're in a power struggle, is that we have to think about how do we get all of the, how do we get churches to move, right? Churches have lots of people, right? How do we get the business sector to move? How do we get politicians, you know, to support our efforts by writing new policy and all that kind of stuff? We need to be thinking about moving groups. The second thing I said was spectacular interventions. One way that culture shifts is through symbolic, disruptive acts of civil resistance, you know? So, like we've seen, right? In January, defund the police was not a conversation that the country was having, right?
Right.
But now, because millions of people all over the world took to the streets in symbolic, disruptive civil resistance, it polarized, right? It drew a line. It raised awareness first. People are going, what? Defund the police? What the heck does that mean, right? And now you're in this conversation about what does public safety look like and what is necessary for public safety, right? Now, everyone's not going to agree, and that's where the polarization comes in. And the polarization is actually not bad. The polarization draws a line in society and creates a social pressure where people have to decide, what side am I on, right? And that's how now, like, this conversation, this paradigm struggle can lead to a new common sense about policing as people start reading books, they start watching TED Talks, they start, like, we're starting to educate the country, or at least continue with the apocalyptic revealing of anti-Black violence in policing, because the conversation is causing people to have to engage in a new way. That's how culture shifts happen.
Yes. Thank you.
I want to take, because I know we're kind of starting to run out of time, and I wish we could have more time with you, but I want to spend a few minutes taking some questions from people. So if anybody has any questions for Andre or even for Michael, and you can either pop it in the chat or just feel free to I don't know, can everybody unmute Tommy if they have a question, or I'm not sure exactly how that works.
Yeah, it's good. So as you're thinking of a question, here's one for you, Andre, because we're talking about civil resistance as a form of loving your city, right? And you kind of already began to kind of map that out, how we can do that, which is kind of almost unsettling. But, and we talked about being a patriot, but how is it this whole work of civil resistance truly reflective of loving a city or a community, right?
Well, I love Los Angeles. I love the mountains. I love the dry heat. I love the cool night. I love the culture, the cultural events that we can go to. I love the fact that, there's so much music and art and all that kind of stuff. And I want to live there. I want to live there as a free person, right? Without fear of state violence. And I want for others to be able to enjoy their life too. When I think about this theologically, I think about how God created human beings for delight. That's why God puts them in the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Pleasure. Eden is a Hebrew word for pleasure. When we're doing justice work, we're trying to tear down the barriers and the partitions and the walls that keep people from being able to enjoy the fruit of the garden, which is this planet, right? And that's one way that we love our city, right? Is that we say, we want for the homeless people, down on Skid Row, these people are being prevented from enjoying the fruit of the garden. That's not fair. That's not right. This exercise of authoritarian power that Donald Trump is using, that threatens our ability to enjoy our lives in Los Angeles, right? And so there's one thing of fighting, or engaging in civil resistance to block and to manage, or to even, I need to find a better word than this, to prevent, the use of that power, that abuse of power, and to create the kind of city that more people can live the kind of life that I believe that God created us for, which is a life where we have access to a life that we can enjoy.
Great.
Thank you.
From Caleb, he says, Dr. King's obviously the elephant in the room in the U.S. conversations on civil resistance. Who are some of your other biggest influences?
Well, my biggest influence is Gene Sharp. Gene Sharp was around during the civil rights movement, but Gene Sharp, the reason why Gene Sharp is such a huge influence for me, and there are many others, Erica Chenoweth, Serge Popovich, Beautiful Trouble. There's a bunch of people who are involved with Beautiful Trouble. I love Beautiful Trouble, but Gene Sharp is my guy because Gene Sharp systematized so much and explained so much about the dynamics of nonviolent struggle and civil resistance. So since Dr. King, we've learned there's still a whole lot to be done in civil resistance studies and nonviolent studies. But Gene Sharp really is a part of a movement that helped to develop our understanding of strategic nonviolence. And I think that if the civil rights movement had it, I mean, if Gene Sharp had just lived like 40 years before Dr. King and was able to write that, I think that the civil rights movement would have been even more effective than it was. I had a conversation, I asked Dr. James Lawson a question, who is a civil rights activist. He led the Nashville sit-ins. He lives in Los Angeles. I asked Dr. James Lawson about strategy, because this is a huge part of having successful civil resistance, is to be strategic, to not just be reactive, to actually, do the work of writing out those pillars, identifying the powers, identifying how we can organize to remove them. And I asked James Lawson about strategy. He said, you know what? He paused, and he really just, he went through his brain, through his memory, and he went, there wasn't a whole lot of strategy. Not that there was none, but in the civil rights movement, he said, there wasn't a whole lot of strategy. But for you all to have the access that you do now, to the information that you do now, and to not be strategic, well, that's a betrayal.
Michael, I think you're muted. Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Another question from John Shaw says, "Great hour, thank you, Andre. 61-year-old white guy here. Who should I be listening to continue learning?"
Wow. Okay. I would definitely recommend following Beautiful Trouble. I love Beautiful Trouble. They have a lot of different books about principles, strategies, tactics for nonviolent struggle. And they are coming out with a new one that's based on African thinkers. And so they have Beautiful Trouble, which was written by a lot of folks who were involved in Occupy Wall Street. They also produced one called Beautiful Rising, which is thinkers from the developing world, their strategies, tactics, methodologies. And now they're coming out with one that's based solely from African thinkers. So they're very creative. Oh, they also have one called Beautiful Solutions that's coming out, which Beautiful Solutions is exactly what it sounds like. It's talking about how do we rethink the world. So that's definitely, look up their website, follow their email list. They're always coming out with things. They even have a strategy card deck that you can buy that has all of these different tactics, principles, stories. I mean, it's wonderful. So I have that card deck. I use it, religiously. Another one I would say is Srđan Popović. He has an organization called Canvas, based out of Serbia, and he has a book called Blueprint for Revolution. So I recommend everybody read Blueprint for Revolution. It takes so much information about civil resistance and puts it in a very fun, colorful, humorous, and short book. But Srđan is worth listening to because he started the group that overthrew Slobodan Milosevic in the year 2000.
Wow.
And so they know what they're talking about. Those are just two off the top of my head. I mean, definitely listen to. Michael and Ben McBride are also great folks to follow. Michelle Higgins from the Movement for Black Lives. I learned so much from Michelle when I get to talk to her. If you just follow her on Twitter, she's sharing so much good information. I mean, I could keep going, but those are some folks that really inspire me.
I've been learning a lot from Rachel Cargle.
Yeah.
As well. Even just following her on Instagram, she has a lot of really great resources.
Of course. Yeah.
So I guess we are pretty much out of time. Are you starting some classes or?
Yeah. We're starting.
Andre, you can continue to learn from him as well. Talk a little bit about that, and then also how people can find you, follow you, all that good stuff. And then of course we'll have all of that in the follow-up emails. Yeah,
of course. So my friend Lauren and I have been on a similar journey. This quest to understand, how do social movements work? How can we be more effective at civil resistance? And she also took the Harvard course with me, which Serja was one of the instructors and all that. And so we decided, with seeing the way that the Trump administration is really trying to undermine whatever form of democracy we have, that it's important for us to get this information out there, because we need millions of people to be informed so that they can participate in civil resistance. And we need to start locally, right? So if LA can resist the dictator, then Pasadena can, and Eagle Rock can, and Glendale can, and Santa Monica can, and then San Diego or maybe Oakland. It can spread, right? Portland, and keep going. So Lauren and I have putting together a 5-week workshop. The first week is just getting to know each other. Our first session is just going to be a digital happy hour where we get to know each other, and we're going to go through a mock revolution. We're gonna put together the strategy for a mock revolution, just so people can learn the concepts and exercise that muscle. Start thinking strategically. It's going to start in September. It's going to start the first Wednesday in September, and each Wednesday we're going to go through. People are going to be divided up into groups where you'll be assigned a city to resist the dictator and to strategize for civil resistance. Right now, so we had to close the sign up because we got over 100 people signed up, but we were prepared for maybe like 30. So our sign up is closed. But the way that you can keep abreast of when we'll open registration for that again is by joining my email list. We'll definitely send out the information on that. I have an email list that goes up every Saturday. It's called Hope and Hard Pills About Racism. And each week I send out just a little blurb. Like I aim for less than 100 words to break down all this information that I'm trying to throw out at you right now in this hour, to just give you a little nugget from that information that I've been gathering about how do we participate in civil resistance,
Yes.
How do we build. Right now, the list has, because we've had a global Black Lives Matter, movement recently, and because of what the president is still trying to do with, trying to defund the postal service so that he can steal the election and all that kind of stuff. Those blurbs right now are aimed at our context. They're not as evergreen as they usually are, because usually I'm doing just big concept, but right now we're also trying to be aware and respond to the news. But that's a great way. So you'll get that blurb. I also send out a curated list of articles about racism, anti-racism that we spotted that week, and then any news and updates. And you can find it at andrehenry.co. That's where you can find it.
All right. Beautiful. Andre, thank you so much for giving your time.
That's my pleasure. It's been so much fun. It feels like I've been talking for 3 minutes.
Yeah, and it seems like the revolution this time will be televised. Right?
Yes, I think so.
Keep it going.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much to all of you who joined us today. And we will definitely be following up with emails with all of Andre's information, and make sure that you get access to be able to find him easily. So thanks so much for joining. Thanks for your questions. Thank you again, Andre. Thank you, Michael.
My pleasure.
Take care.